A chef turned shooter. Police say a man walked into this restaurant and opened fire, killing a coworker and injuring another. Then, a twist. The shooter was the restaurant's executive chef, and the victim he killed had worked with the restaurant's ownership group. What a scary situation that played out in a busy, popular part of Raleigh, North Carolina, at a very popular restaurant. I'll tell you a little bit more about the person who's been identified as the shooter, their background, including a criminal history. But first, I want to get you caught up to speed on exactly what played out. It was Friday morning, just before the restaurant Coquette opened for lunch. And you can see from these pictures on the restaurant's Instagram page that it's a classic French restaurant. Looks like a really nice place to go grab a bite to eat. It's located in a busy shopping district in an area of Raleigh known as North Hills. So when shots were fired in broad daylight, it sparked a major response from police. Schools were closed. Even the state's governor put a post on social media out about it. Police are being relatively tight-lipped about the investigation at this point, but here's what we do know. According to police, a shooter walked into the restaurant just before it was set to open for its lunch shift. That shooter shooting and killing one person and then injuring another person. And that injured person was an employee of the restaurant. They told WRAL-TV the restaurant staff was getting ready for their shift with a meeting and also celebrating a bartender's birthday when George Colom entered the restaurant and opened fire. And it turns out Colom was the restaurant's executive chef. We found his Facebook page where he often posted pictures in his chef uniform, and he often posted about the food he made. This is one of the last real posts that he put up from December, and you can see the restaurant where this shooting took place is tagged. It also turns out that Colom had a criminal record and served time in federal prison, according to WRAL. We found by looking up federal court records that Colom was sentenced to 40 months in prison on a stolen firearm charge in 2011, and according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, was released from custody in 2013. The person who was killed has been identified as Jonathan Schaefer. That is according to local media reports, and we found the 26-year-old's LinkedIn page. It lists that he worked for the ownership group of the restaurant where this shooting took place. At the time of this recording, it's still unclear what the exact motive was for this shooting. Police did say it seemed to stem from a disagreement between the shooter and the victim who was killed, but exactly what that disagreement was, police haven't said, though they are saying they'll release that information once it becomes available. The restaurant still appears to be closed. They posted on their social media pages saying that the restaurant and its ownership group has gone through a terrible tragedy and they're working with their staff to make sure they're okay. There is a GoFundMe page for the restaurant staff that's raised more than $25,000 to help people who have been impacted by this shooting. As for the shooter, George Colom, he turned the gun on himself and he would die in the hospital days later. Joining us now is retired NYPD Detective Sergeant Dan Murphy, who has experience when it comes to the world of workplace shootings and understanding ways of how to prevent them. So a great person to talk to as we break down this story out of North Carolina. Dan, what do you make of what we've seen thus far of this case where you have this executive chef going in and shooting two coworkers at a restaurant?
You know, these are not unusual cases, sadly. They happen quite often. Any place you put people together, there's bound to be tensions. How people handle those tensions and those disagreements results in whether or not we go to violence or we go away from it. Now, in this case, there's a lot to be learned about the shooter, a lot to be learned about the dynamics of the interpersonal relationships in this workplace. But I can tell you that there isn't a workplace out there that doesn't have some friction between people. And sometimes it boils over. And in this case, it boiled over in a terrible way.
Yeah, it certainly did. You have one employee who died, another who has non-life-threatening injuries, but then the shooter turns the gun on himself and he's passed away. So you don't have him to talk to in terms of what could have led him to this motive. What are detectives doing right now to try and figure out what exactly was behind all of this?
Taking a very deep dive into his life. We have to learn about this individual, what was going on in their life. First of all, the dynamics of the relationship with the intended target or targets at work. People typically leak their intentions in advance, whether that be through social media, communications with friends, text messages, you name it. Somebody somewhere in this person's life knows that he was bubbling up to this point. And secondly, you have to look at not just the motivations, but a person's understanding of the consequences of taking such an action. I would typically look at a person like this and I try to figure out what do they have going on in their life that's worthwhile? And is that worth staying alive for and working through a situation? Also, looking at a criminal past. Now, we understand there was a criminal past for this individual, involved a federal prison stint for a illegal weapon possession, which says something about them. It doesn't necessarily say they're going to go to this level, but it does say something about them. And this is a common thing that employers butt heads against all the time: is I need to hire somebody, but they have this thing in their past. Does that make them a danger, or is it okay? There's a lot of things they're going to be looking deeply into this person to find out whether or not they had a history of mental health issues, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, how they were financially. Do they have any significant relationships in their life that are left after this, or is it something where this person had nothing much to live for, and this job meant a lot to them? There's many considerations, but they're going to find out a lot about this
Yeah.
person, and we'll see what we learn in the next 48 to 72 hours.
And I want to talk about the criminal record a little bit more because, in hindsight, with everything that played out, you look at a federal illegal firearms charge that puts someone in federal prison for 40 months. And you sit there and you're like, why would you hire that person? Just as someone on the outside with hindsight of everything that happened, but that was more than a decade ago.
Mhm.
As someone who has looked at workplace shootings, the causes of workplace shootings, I, without knowing, I mean, is that something that should have prevented him from actually getting this job?
Not necessarily. You look at many things. I always believe in mistakes of the head versus mistakes of the heart. Now, in this case, somebody who has an illegal firearm um, and gets arrested with it, it could be an indicator of many things. It could be an indicator they were involved in criminal activity. It could be an indicator that they just purchased a firearm from somebody and didn't know the history of it because they wanted self-defense. It could mean a lot of things. You have to look at it in a totality of the circumstances sort of perspective. But looking at a criminal history, what it says to me is this is a person who doesn't really have all that much respect for the law necessarily, or they made a one-off mistake. I would look to see if a person has violence in their background, because the single greatest predictor of future violence is past violence. Now, this was not a violent act, but it was the possession of a weapon that was illegal. So there's a lot of ways you can look at this. I've seen organizations go to extremes. They don't want to hire anybody with any criminality. And then I've seen others that believe in second chances and they overlook significant red flags. This one kind of falls in the middle. It really depends upon what the nature of that possession of the weapon was for.
Police believe that this shooting was an isolated incident between the person who died and then the shooter in this case, that it stemmed from some sort of dispute. That's the big question. We don't know what that dispute is. But in your experience, typically we talk about the friction in a lot of workplaces, but to lead to the point where you bring a gun to work and kill somebody, what typically is the driver of so many of these workplace incidents that we've seen over the years?
In my experience, what I've seen is it's the person themselves and how they handle conflict. If you see a person who handles conflict through the use or the threat of violence, or they become frustrated and they move to violence easily, that's a person that doesn't really have to cross a big bridge to get there. They've already done this. This is how they conduct themselves. This could have been a romantic situation with a third party involved. This could have been a financial situation where the money meant a lot to him. It could be a pride or ego thing. I think a lot more will come out, but typically, what you see in these situations is people who themselves, no matter where they go, they were a bad hire because no matter where they work, they're going to be problematic and they're going to have conflict with people. This is not a typical response to an interpersonal difficulty with somebody. This is an extreme one done by people who typically go to extreme lengths to settle differences.
And it's the type of story because this was a nice looking restaurant. It's in a busy, popular shopping area of Raleigh. I mean, it's kind of cliche to say it's the type of place you would never expect something like this to
Mhm.
happen. But I think a lot of people will look at this and be like, how, at my workplace, there's probably coworkers I don't like, or I would hope not, but coworkers who don't like me. Uh, how do you prevent something from actually escalating to the point where it gets to this type of level?
This is a small restaurant. I've worked as a head of security for large companies, and I've been involved in many, many situations that have been brought to my attention regarding disputes between people in the workplace or external relationships that bleed over into the workplace. The best way to prevent any of this stuff is to have mechanisms in place whereby people can report anonymously if they wish, situations that they become aware of that are of concern. I can guarantee you this person made somebody uncomfortable in their workplace because they have something about them, their personality, their vibe is probably explosive. We need to know that in order to intervene in situations before they go to violence. I have a great deal of experience, and many other people do in this field, when it comes to assessing, investigating, and managing these situations away from violence. It can be done, and it's done all the time. And in this case, with a small organization that doesn't have an infrastructure to do that, sometimes people just become accustomed to, well, that's just John. Let's say he's explosive. That's just John, and they put up with it because they don't know what else to do with it. And in this case, he may have been a very valuable chef, and often people ignore red flags because that person is such a valuable employee. And I think we'll learn a lot more in the future. But it's a sad dynamic that can take place within organizations who are not equipped to properly intervene beforehand.
And I think of the restaurant industry, I never worked in it myself, but it seems like a pressure filled industry, especially if this looks like it was a really nice restaurant. There was, the images
Mhm.
that he posted on his social media showed some nice dishes, probably cliche people yelling at each other in the kitchen. I mean, in your experience, is a restaurant a place where typically you do see that pressure dynamic, and it can be the type of place where something like this can happen?
I could see it happening in any workplace, and I think it's good to note that it doesn't matter what type of workplace it is. We have seen workplace violence situations in all manner of workplaces, in all manner of zip codes and demographics, and median income ranges. It doesn't matter where it is. It happens because it happens between people. But in a restaurant environment, you're right. There is a lot of pressure, especially in a really upscale restaurant. There's pressure to maintain service times. There's pressure to maintain quality of service and food. And for somebody to be a chef, now I'm not a chef, but I understand there's a hierarchy. And by the time you become a head chef or a master chef in a kitchen like this, you're an accomplished person. You've done a lot. And in many times, you have a big ego about the fact that you are the chef because people view you as the lead. And in this case, there may have been some affront to that. He took a great pride in what he does. I've never met a chef who didn't, and there may be a dynamic there with regards to whether it be ego, or him being offended, or his work not being valued. A great many things come to mind, and I'm eager to see what the investigation is going to yield on this one.
I am as well, because the employee who was shot but survived and spoke to a local TV station. I mean, he called the shooter head chef George. So there is still even that hierarchy that you
Right.
hear about. That even after he had witnessed this, he still has that official title for him. And he said that seemed very shocked. Obviously, in the early hours after something like that happened, how common is it that there are no red flags? And it's just something that certainly maybe there was a dispute, maybe there wasn't. It was just something, the idea that we'll never find out what the motive was.
I think to anyone who's been trained and schooled in the world of threat assessment, there's always red flags. There's no such thing as a person who goes from being perfectly normal and well adjusted and having good relationships at work and personally to suddenly shooting up a restaurant. It doesn't work that way. People move along a continuum towards violence. Whether or not somebody recognizes it, whether or not they share that that's happening within themselves, whether or not somebody reports it, is all intangibles. But in this matter, I would bet dollar to donuts that this individual here had red flag behaviors, red flag activity, and communications, whether they be to the world in general, or just to intimate people in his life, about their frustrations and about their desire to do something about it.
What's the best piece of advice that you have to people who go to work every day and they don't want to be in a situation, obviously, like the one that took place here in Raleigh? What's
Mhm.
the best piece of advice when it comes to preventing these types of situations?
I think for the average person, for the layperson who's not a security professional or risk professional or HR, I would say it's very important to tap into the resources within your organization. When you become aware of a situation that makes you feel uncomfortable, if there's an employee that you work with who is giving off some form of vibe and makes you feel uncomfortable, you must act on that. Because as Gavin DeBecker wrote in his very famous book, The Gift of Fear, intuition is a gift. We have it for a reason. It's there to protect us. If you get a feeling that something is wrong, it's wrong. and you should act on it. And most of the time we see after these events happen, people will come forward and say, yeah, he was a little off. He always made me feel weird or uncomfortable, but they don't do anything about it. I would say, don't be afraid to do something about it. Any organization that's a real organization is not going to hold it against you if you're wrong. They're going to look into it, and it's for the safety of everyone, not just for yourself.
And just before we go, I know that you have had a long career of investigating several cases, but you have written a book on workplace safety. What is it about this dynamic, these types of cases that we've seen, that's drawn your expertise, it's something that you have wanted to become an expert on?
When I first left the NYPD and I went into the corporate world, I was introduced to the world of threat assessment and management by a peer, coworker, who was my co-author on the book, Randy Ferris. And he introduced me to the concept of really digging deep on interpersonal relationship issues in the workplace. I had been a police detective most of my career, and I dealt with situations typically after the fact. But in these cases, when you run security for an organization, you own these situations as they're going on. And you have to understand the dynamics at play, the psychology behind it. You have to understand whether or not the person involved or people involved have something to lose, whether they are simply voicing or spouting off frustration, or if they are actually going towards violence. And it requires a comprehensive look. So I became very fascinated by this, and I was schooled by the DeBecker team out in California twice, and handled thousands of situations. And over a while, you start seeing things that are commonalities in human behavior, and that those are red flags, indicators that a person is moving, what we call precursor behaviors, moving towards violence. Once you identify that, then you have to come up with a game plan to manage that situation. You have to learn everything you can about the person's history. Do they handle their frustrations and stresses through violence? Are they someone who would ignore a court order, let's say? If you had a protective order served on them, would they pay attention to it? Would they be fearful of the court, or would it inflame the situation? There are many considerations, and I'll call it a pseudoscience, but it is one that is building based upon the number of cases that have come up. And there are things that you can do. And I was very lucky and blessed to work with great people who we managed to keep a great many situations away from violence because we learned about them early enough. And we were able to take steps working with third-party experts. These are serious situations, and these can be the end of an organization. Some organizations do not recover from workplace violence situations because it's costly. There's lawsuits, there's loss of life, loss of confidence. No one wants to work there anymore. So you have to take this stuff seriously. And I would recommend to any organizations out there listening, take it seriously, make an investment in your company in this sort of thing, even if it's just having a third-party expert on hand. That stuff can be a lifesaver more than the obvious ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an incredibly sad story, but there are a lot of questions that are unanswered. It'll be fascinating to see what police announce next. Dan Murphy, retired NYPD Detective Sergeant, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
There are still so many questions that are unanswered involving this story and what the motive may be. We'll stay on top of it and keep you posted. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.